That was very fast.
We're live, yeah? Excellent. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Pablo Navarrete on behalf of Wipalas across the world. Welcome to this event. Bienvenido primero rápido a los que están aquí uniéndose desde Bolivia, desde cualquier otro país hispanohablante que no habla inglés. Ya rapidito es para decir que este evento tiene un traductor y pueden acceder, la información se va a compartir en el chat de cómo poder tener el intérprete para que puedan tener la traducción de todo lo que se va a hablar. Pero este evento va a ser en inglés. That was a quick English announcement to the Spanish speakers to tell them that there is a Spanish interpretation live for this event, which lasts 2 hours and is exploring the role of the media, the mainstream media, other independent media in reporting on Bolivia, but also Latin America. So not only the Anglophone English-speaking language media, but also media in countries such as Brazil and in Bolivia itself. So I'm really happy to have been asked to chair this event. I'm the editor and founder of Alborada, which is a platform that sort of explores issues around Latin American politics, media and culture. It's been going for more than 10 years. There's also a production company associated with it that releases documentaries on issues around Latin America and increasingly not just about Latin America. So it's the issue of the media and how the media report or misreport really. Latin America is one that's very close to my heart. So I'm delighted to be chairing this panel that's got some really great speakers. So the people you'll be hearing from are in this order. Hopefully Olly Vargas, who I think is yet to enter the room or enter the Zoom, but who I've been assured is joining us. Olly is in Bolivia, an independent journalist who writes for, and I always get this pronunciation wrong, so I'm going to just check my notes. Kawasachun News, a great new I think it's new in English at least. It's relatively new, 1 or 2 years, and it's really made a massive mark in terms of showcasing left-wing politics from a left-wing perspective, and it's not just Bolivia but Latin America itself. So hopefully Olly will join us. I think I had planned for Olly to begin. But obviously, if he joins later, we'll get to him after that. We also have Nathalia, a Brazilian journalist, UK-based, who writes for a large, if I was listing them all, I'd probably be here all night. But Brazil Wire is one of the main outlets that she writes for, which is an excellent independent website. If you haven't come across it, it's brazilwire.com. And it's really one of the foremost, or the foremost website covering Brazilian politics. So I would urge you to explore that. We also have with us, very happy to have Chris Hazzard, an MP for Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican Party. And for those of you that don't know too much about Sinn Féin, if you're they are an Irish Republican political party, and the MPs, of which Chris Hazzard is one, they abstain from the British Parliament. So while Chris has an office in London, he does not swear an oath of allegiance to the English monarch, and thus does not sit in the House of Commons. But Sinn Féin have been really at the forefront of solidarity with left-wing and progressive forces in Latin America, in the UK and Ireland. And so we're really delighted to have this really unique perspective from Chris. And finally, we have Hugo Albuquerque. Hopefully I said that relatively well. Brazilian, also journalist, co-editor, I think co-founder as well of Jacobin Brazil. Many of you might know Jacobin, and Jacobin Latin America, a more recent addition to the media sphere in Spanish, and Jacobin Brazil in now Portuguese. So he's also the founder and co-editor of the publisher Editora Autonomia Literaria, and so he's got a lot of unique perspectives to bring us. So that's the order. The order was going to be Olly first, but I don't think he's here. So I think we'll start with Nathalia. But before we do, sorry, just to backtrack. So it's a 2-hour session. So we're going until 9 p.m. UK time. The idea is that each of the panelists give us around 10 minutes initial intervention, and then we will take questions that are coming in from Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and feel free, I think, to put questions into the Zoom chat as well. And then obviously we'll just have a discussion around the issues of media coverage, Latin America. Just to say, I think we have Jeanette here from Wipalas Across the World, France, who is going to just tell us a little bit more about this initiative, this 14-day festival, 14 Days of Resistance. I think this is the 6th or 7th event out of 9 or something like that, but she will explain the thinking behind this event and why, you know, why this event is taking place. So Janet, I believe, or someone from Wipalas, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pablo, for the introduction, and yes, and thanks for also organizing this this special meeting, part of the 14 Days of Resistance organized by Wipalas across the world. Yes, I just want to say a couple of words also on how it was created. Wipalas across the world, you know, just after the coup in Bolivia, there were many residents, Bolivian residents abroad, in Europe mainly. We wanted to, we were like desperate when we see all what happened in Bolivia. So we just put together to enforce and to be the voice for people that were in Bolivia suffering the fascist regime. So we are different organizations organized that we create Wipalas across the world, and we are continue our work even if now we already are in a democratic state in Bolivia. We recover democracy, but we know that what we have now, we have to take care, and we need to protect. And these 2 weeks of resistance is part of this. We need to make here in Europe and make recognize the European authority that what we live in Bolivia was a coup. And we mark them here also as that we are going to look for justice. Bolivians need to know the truth, what was the role of the European authorities in Bolivia. So these meetings, it's for us to explore and to also exchange between all different experience, also because we know that different countries, like for example now recently in Peru, they are all also they are suffering from for example the problems of the communication on the media, because they don't tell the truth of what is happening. They support the right parties in our region. So this kind of meeting is for us to tell the truth to the rest of citizens in Europe. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you, Pablo, and let's continue with the meeting.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Janet. Before we begin, also just to say that Wyatt Reed was on the poster or on some of the listings. Unfortunately, he can't join us tonight. He's also a very good independent journalist covering Latin America. And right on, I've just seen that Olly Vargas has fashionably late entered the Zoom, and he maybe we'll let him speak second, so that he gets just we don't immediately just ask him to speak. And maybe I could come to you, Nathalia, if you don't mind. I don't know if Olly, are you okay to just begin? I think, given that you're in Bolivia and the focus of this event is on the coup, its aftermath, I think it would make a lot of sense for you to sort of kick us off. Can you hear me? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Olly. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you, Pablo, and thank you to all the organizers of the event. I think it's incredibly important, topic upon which to explore. And the role of the press is, in the coup in Bolivia, is the main reason that we set up Causation News as a project, and now as a website, and hopefully much more. Because when in the run up to the coup in Bolivia, what there was a situation of chaos in the streets. The right wing, middle class, and upper class groups, who were numerous but not a majority, were determined to not let themselves be governed by someone they regard to be their social inferior. They'd allowed themselves to be governed by their social inferior for 14 years, and they weren't going to put up with it any longer. So as soon as the voting took place in 2019, in October of 2019, immediately it became clear that Evo Morales was heading in to another election victory, with a slightly lower majority than previous years, but with the necessary support to win in the first round. So then what happened immediately after that, immediately after the voting closed, was they began to cry electoral fraud without any evidence. And Carlos Mesa, the main pro-coup candidate, someone who'd consider himself a liberal, called his supporters out onto the streets, and they began burning down vote counting centers. And from there was unleashed a much wider street protest movement in the upper class neighborhoods of the big cities. However, this reality wasn't being broadcasted, communicated to the outside world. What was being communicated instead via newspapers such as The Guardian and the rest of the media in the UK and the US was that this was a citizens' revolt. Bolivian voters have had enough of Evo Morales, of the movement towards socialism, and now they're coming out to the streets against electoral fraud that has taken place to ensure that he stays in power. Something that was not mentioned at all, and which the readers, viewers who aren't, in tune with the details of what happens in the context of what goes on in Bolivia, which is, of course, the majority. The mainstream media never really covered Bolivia almost at all before the coup. They never really covered Bolivia in its remarkable economic growth for the past 14 years under Evo Morales' economic model. That was never really covered, but now it was starting to be talked about. So, of course, the viewers, readers, didn't know a great deal about context of these things. So, this was all taken as fact. What was not included was that all of these protests that were taking place against Evo Morales in 2019, all of them were taking place in the upper class neighborhoods of the big cities. That is to say, the south, the zona sur of the city of La Paz, the zona norte of Cochabamba, in the inner parts of Santa Cruz. There were never any protests in 2019 against Evo Morales in working class areas of those three cities, in El Alto, or in the zona sur of Cochabamba, or in Plan 3000 in Santa Cruz. There are absolutely none at all in any of the indigenous rural areas of the country. There was a really clear class divide in what was going on, but none of this was being communicated to the outside world. What we had instead was, many, especially those in the UK, will have seen, for example, Patrick Winter, the diplomatic editor of The Guardian, talking about, using this issue, which he knew very little about, to attack Jeremy Corbyn, saying, how can Jeremy Corbyn, express solidarity with people like Evo Morales who've committed electoral fraud in Bolivia, and who's whose people are now taking to the streets, calling for democracy and all of this. So all of the nuances, all of the class divides that were, the most important aspect of what happened in 2019, all of that was, none of that was communicated. The racial aspect, the manner in which none of the protesters against Evo Morales were from indigenous groups, were from, majority indigenous areas, that was never communicated to the outside world. It was all just framed as the Bolivian people, Bolivian citizens protesting against Evo Morales. And it forced me to pose the question to those media outlets on any platform that I could, is, well, aren't working class Bolivians, aren't indigenous Bolivians also the Bolivian people? Aren't they also citizens? Why has that voice of the majority, the physical majority of the country, just completely deleted, subsumed into this protest movement of a really small middle class minority, the so-called Pititas? And they were given this name by Evo Morales because they, during these protests, they used to go into their upper class neighborhoods. They didn't really know how to protest, and working class Bolivians protest by erecting barricades and, along key high motorways, etc. So what these upper class people did was they put sort of the washing line and things like this across their roads, their residential roads in the upper class areas of the big cities. And so to make fun of them, everyone said, oh, they're a bunch of pititas, with their pititas, they have little ropes, they think they can overturn the will of the majority. But in the end, what happened was that protest movement was successful in generating enough violence on the streets to create an environment of chaos. And then the military was able to step in with the excuse of restoring order, and the coup was consolidated. But all of that, the chaos, the violence that was imposed by these right-wing groups was never communicated either to the outside world. What was, the portrayal given on the BBC with the sort of images they used was a sort of, Arab Spring type awakening of Bolivian citizens taking to the streets calling for democracy. What was never communicated was the violence that they employed, assaulting indigenous women on the streets of La Paz, of Cochabamba, of Santa Cruz. What was never communicated was the kidnapping, torture of Patricia Arce, who's now a senator, but was at the time mayor of Tanco Vinto, in Cochabamba. And she was taken out and told her, you have to resign, you have to condemn Evo Morales, and she refused. And they took her out, they cut off her hair, doused her in petrol, made her walk across broken glass, and they told her that they were walking her to her death. And all of that, the terror that was unleashed by these upper class groups was never communicated to the outside world, because if it had, people would be able to see it for what it was, which was a very traditionally fascist movement that had taken over the streets through the streets of the certain sections of urban areas to try and overturn the vote of the majority. So that's why we launched this initiative, Causation News. Causation News is the English language section of Radio Causation Kokan. During the coup, it was the only, more so after the coup, the only Bolivian media outlet that communicated anything to do with the social movements opposed to the coup. Going into the coup, all of the private media in Bolivia was anti-movement towards socialism, anti-Evo Morales. But that was counterbalanced a tiny bit by the fact that there were state media outlets, state TV channel, state radio station, the state newspaper, that was able to communicate the side of the government on various issues. But of course, with the coup, those institutions are turned over to the new people who own the state, the people who declared themselves president, and the right-wing interests that took over. All of those media outlets turned to continued to express the line of the government, which had now changed. All of the people who worked there were fired. New people were brought in. So all of a sudden, there was no media outlets on the left. The only one that remained was Radio Kausachinkoka, which was never a national outlet. It was a local community radio station in the tropic of Cochabamba, which is the bastion of the movement towards socialism, where Evo Morales was a union leader. And because it was in this bastion, it was protected by people. The police and military were expelled from this region when the coup took place. And so this outlet was able to continue going, transmitting the opinions, the views, the struggles of ordinary people who had been silenced now with the coup. And because the simple act of doing that, of literally just showing what people were doing on the streets, turned it into the biggest outlet in the country. Everyone was looking to it, see what is going on with the struggle, what's going on with those who are opposing the coup. So out of that, we created Kausach News to do the same, but in English, to transmit the viewpoints of the majority of the country, of the social movements of Bolivia, not just in the region, but of the organized social movements across Bolivia. And now that as we're emerging from the coup, as we are in conditions of democracy, without threats of closure, of being taken over, hanging over us, we decided to sort of step things up and to roll this out for the whole of Latin America, to try and be a voice for social movements across the region. Whether it be elections in Peru, movements in Venezuela, try to be there as a media outlet that accompanies social movements, that transmits people's views, because that's something that's just not done in the mainstream media. In media, The Guardian or the BBC, how do they gather news? Most of the time, their correspondents can't even speak Spanish. They have to rely on English-speaking reporters of the mainstream media within the countries that they're talking about. And who speaks English and works in the media in countries like Bolivia? Well, it's upper-class people. And what are their politics? Well, we know what they are. So all of the information they gather comes through the filter of the mainstream media and the biases that they have. So the voices of indigenous groups, of workers' unions are never there. So what we do is just putting the other side. And I think just simply doing that on its own, it's incredibly important, because no one else is going to do it. No one else is doing it. Absolutely. And we hope to be able to develop that.
Great. No, thank you so much. And there's a couple of things there that I want to ask more on, but let's now turn to if someone could put the website in English, in case you haven't come across Olly's, maybe Olly can do it in the chat. But yeah, I would really urge you. It's become in a very short period of time a major reference for people wanting this alternative, this challenge to the mainstream misreporting on Latin America. So I want to turn to Nathalia now, if that's all right. Nathalia, I mean, there's a broad subject that we're discussing. Obviously, Bolivia is the entry point into exploring media and Latin America and Bolivia. But yeah, I know you have a number of observations, some which touch on Bolivia, but some that obviously touch on Brazil and more generally. So I'll leave over to you.
Thank you, Pablo. First of all, thank you so much for all the guests and people who are watching us, and in Spanish and English as well. We all know that Brazil has a huge problem right now with Bolsonaro and the rise of the far right. But before that, we had a long case of the Anglophonic media normalizing the rise of Bolsonaro, supporting the rise of Bolsonaro. And why is that? It's not just why Bolsonaro was elected a president, but it was because how Bolsonaro was elected a president in Brazil. Because before Bolsonaro, we had a government, the PT government, that was extremely aligned with the whole Latin America countries, especially with the movements, the socialist movements in Latin America. And it was dangerous for the international press, the international powers, to have Brazil, who is a regional power, taking their role there, because Brazil has always alienated itself from the rest of the continent for several reasons, cultural, social ones, and of course, political ones, but mainly because of the language as well. And when we had Lula, especially Lula in power, Lula made sure to strengthen our ties with the neighboring countries and the neighboring movements who are fighting against imperialism, who are fighting against the domination of Europe and United States, of course. And so the media started to create a narrative in Brazil that Lula, the PT, was corrupt. We all know how this turned out. And we all know that Lula was unjustly accused of many crimes orchestrated by the United States, orchestrated by the DOJ. And now Lula is innocent. Lula will hopefully run next year as a president. But we have a debt with the other countries in Latin America, especially in the South America, because Bolsonaro is using the regional power we have as the biggest country, the richest country, to undermine the others' authority, like the role that Bolsonaro disgracefully played in the coup in Bolivia. And even though we are talking about the press, this is where I want to go, is that the Brazilian press was virtually silent through the whole coup. We only had people from the independent media in Brazil. I was one of the people. We had other journalists like Lucas and Rogério from Revista Fórum. Of course, we had Jacob in Brazil, Carla Burgoa, who is a Bolivian journalist who lives in Brazil as well. But virtually, we did not have a single person from the corporate media in Brazil talking about the coup, because the Brazilian media, even though we are so close to the countries in Latin America, most of the content the Brazilian receives from Latin America comes from the United States and the European agencies. So they do have a biased view towards those countries. So when Bolivia was living through a coup, Brazilian was selling the idea that Evo Morales was corrupt, that he had, it was a bogus election, and that the people did not wanted him there. When we had the massacres in Brazil, the media was super silent about it. The same way the media is silenced right now with the horrors that are happening in Colombia and even with the situation in Peru. Because the Brazilian media basically copies everything that Anglo media is reporting. And the Anglo media is not reporting that the people in Latin America, in South America especially, we want radical changes. We are seeking radical governments that are, of course, of left-leaning governments to change the horrors and the poverty and the inequalities we are forced to live in the continent. So they censor this type of wording, this type of news to arrive in Brazil, because they don't want Brazil to feel that it's influenced by this type of thing. And also because there is virtually not a point of difference between those people who are with Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro government itself and the so-called Centrão and the so-called like moderate conservatives in Brazil. They all have the same opinion when it comes to Latin America, that Venezuela is a dictatorship, that everything is horrible in Nicaragua, that Cuba is also a dictatorship, that Evo Morales is corrupt, that Alberto Fernandes is a communist agent. Anyway, that Bolsonaro is one of the people that has been collaborating incessantly with all the big neo-fascists we have in South America. He collaborated with Agnes in Bolivia. He collaborates with Duque in Colombia. He collaborates with Piñera, and we don't have no one writing about it because it's not their interest to make the people in Brazil to know that Bolsonaro is collaborating with those people. Because when Bolsonaro is out and the candidate that the corporate media wants, that is one of the moderate conservatives, he will stand supporting the same people Bolsonaro supports, because they know it's dangerous for the continent, for the establishment in Brazil, to have all the neighboring countries seeking out their sovereignty, their independence, and revolutionary way to deal with their society. And of course, they don't want that. So this is, I know Brazil Wire is an important outlet writing and investigating the role that the European and especially the United States takes on Brazilian politics, but also I'm trying to do there a role that is showing for the English-speaking public that Brazil is not an innocent country when it comes to South America, that Brazil exerts a lot of sub-imperialism when it comes to Bolivia, when it comes to Colombia, when it comes to Venezuela, and this has to be said. And I think that so far right now, what we are seeing is that the people in Brazil are getting more interested to know about Latin America. They are trying to create the parties, the left parties in Brazil. They are trying to create a conscience that we won't achieve any relevant changes in Brazil if we are not united with all our South America, especially South American brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nathalia. That's a really important point. How sort of Brazil is often, you know, separated from the rest of Latin America. Obviously, the language is a natural divider, but there is also this kind of the lack of bridges in terms of Chileans knowing about what's going on in Brazil and vice versa, and Colombia. And so I think, yeah, there is a lot of work to be done to kind of build those bridges through independent media. I mean, even Alvorada and Brazil Wire and Kawasachi News probably need to come together and see how we can support each other and amplify these. So next, I would like to invite Chris Hazzard. As I said, a Sinn Féin MP. We're really happy to have him joining us. And Chris will talk about Sinn Féin's solidarity with the Latin American left, and also, I guess, make observations about how the press in Ireland report or misreport progressive and left-wing governments, and obviously probably minimize the crimes of the friends of the UK and the US, either minimize or just completely ignore. So over to you, Chris.
Gormo, I get Pablo agus Trúna Moy, Dave Golair. Thanks, Pablo. Good evening to everybody, and thanks again for the invite to participate, and which I believe a really important festival of solidarity. Indeed, when the Friends of Bolivia group held an event last year following the election, I said that night that the most important thing that we in the international community could do in the months ahead was to ensure that the henchmen of the coup weren't allowed to slip into the shadows and disappear, that they would have to face justice for their crimes against the people of Bolivia, for the massacres, the repression and the corruption, that the usual suspects in the global north would undoubtedly try to resuscitate their fortunes that they have tried to do. They would try to persuade people that they were simply political prisoners being unfairly punished. So I'm delighted to say that Sinn Féin have rejected this blatant propaganda line. We've done so publicly, both in London, at home in Dublin, but also in the EU in recent weeks as well. We remain very proud to stand with Arce and the people of Bolivia in restoring peace, delivering justice, and returning dignity and freedom to the people and to the working class and the social movements of Bolivia. Of course, internationalism has always been at the core of Irish republicanism. Indeed, Irish republicanism itself is a product of international ideas and influences. Irish Republicans have always been proud to stand firmly against colonialism and imperialism in Ireland and across the world, including Latin America. You know, we live by the maxim first offered by Che Guevara that if you let the world change you, you too can also change the world. Nathalia and John McAvoy's excellent recent article in Jacobin correctly identified that rebellious Irish blood was essential during Latin America's emancipatory struggles, which is very true. But they were also correct to state that it's only one side of the coin. Irish revolutionaries themselves have also taken great inspiration, as well as strategic and tactical instruction, from compañeros across the Atlantic Ocean. During recent decades of armed conflict and anti-colonial struggle, the connection with Cuba and Nicaragua was obvious. So too with the Allende in Chile, whose dramatic rise to power and fall at the hands of the imperialists coincided with the rise of our own civil rights movement in Ireland and the collapse of the colonial Orange State in the north. But in the next stage of struggle, from prison to parliament, Latin America does continue to provide political activists here in Ireland with lessons in victory and of course also in defeat. The link with Cuba remains strong. In 2016, the then Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams was an invited guest at Fidel Castro's funeral. Speaking to the assembled media in Havana, he said, "Today we mourn the death of one of the great revolutionary leaders, a hero and a friend of Ireland." It caused an absolute furore at home in Ireland and in Britain with the media, but we remained incorrigible in that line, and so too did the vast amount of Irish people. Sinn Féin youth brigades continue to travel out to Cuba regularly, and last year it was a real privilege to nominate the Henry Reeve International Brigades for the Nobel Peace Prize for their ongoing humanitarian efforts, as it was too last week to erect the world's largest Cuban flag on the mountains above Belfast in solidarity with Cuba in the days before the UN vote on the ongoing illegal embargo. As a party, we also continue to publish a Latin America bulletin to our members and support network in Britain, Europe, and further afield. This contains important political updates, such as the recent wave of protests against Duque in Colombia, and offers a valuable platform for information to be shared. This has proven particularly valuable in recent years, given the increased and sustained lawfare attacks on the people of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Brazil, and the failure of mainstream media in Europe to cover these issues. In regards to Bolivia, whilst no official linkages have fully developed yet with Bolivia in recent times, interest is steadily growing in the endeavours of the plurinational state, not merely in respect to the success of Morales and Arce more recently, but also David Choquehuanca's drive to embed a renewed ecological and ethical appreciation of the region's indigenous heritage, which has become a real source of inspiration for grassroots eco-socialists here in Ireland. This interest in Pachamismo has seen in recent years during the Right to Water campaign against the Irish state's attempt to privatise the national water system, a fight that drew direct strength from the Cochabamba water wars just a few years previously. Indeed, the strength of this renewed ecological and anti-colonial paradigm in Bolivia, with its deep roots in grassroots social movements, continues to inspire similar movements, not just in Brazil with the landless workers movement, but in South Africa with the shack dwellers, the farmers movement in India, and steadily, I'm glad to say, a coalescence of Irish Republican and grassroots eco-socialist movements here in Ireland. The strength of this growing eco-socialism is evident in the pages and articles of Phoblacht, which is Sinn Féin's media platform. Nearly half of this month's magazine is dedicated to discussions on community wealth building, corporate taxation, environment and climate action, and native and indigenous language rights, following a recent edition which also examined the success of participative budgeting as seen first in Porto Alegre in Brazil. It's clear then that opportunities for new exciting links between Irish grassroots socialist movements and those in Latin America might just flourish once again. And Republican media platforms such as Phoblacht are central to this. And perhaps I'll just finish by giving an overview of Phoblacht and the role of Republican media in that type of struggle. Through the various stages of struggle for Irish freedom, from the United Irishmen in the late 18th century, the Young Irelanders and the Fenians in the mid-19th century, and of course the IRA and Sinn Féin throughout the 20th century, the role of the media has always been closely aligned with the capitalist interests of the ruling elite. For the most part, this was of course the colonial interests of the British Empire, and more latterly the British state in the north of Ireland, and the conservative ruling elite which came to power in the south following the Irish War of Independence 100 years ago. So in attempting to break the link with Britain, Irish revolutionaries have had to also deal with perpetual state censorship, marginalisation and demonisation. Section 31, for example, was the Irish state censorship of Sinn Féin in order to demonise Republicans. So for example, Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin from 1983, was only permitted to speak on Irish TV 11 years later in 1994. When Phoblacht became the revolutionary outlet for Republicans for the last 50 years. It was arguably one of Europe's finest weekly political newspapers. It's now a monthly magazine with social media platforms and online editions. Its staff and sellers risked their lives to get out the truth about what was happening in Ireland and various international anti-colonial struggles around the world. Its writers were vital in countering the propaganda and lies of Britain's dirty war here in Ireland. Significantly, those editing Phoblacht were always acutely aware of the inseparable relationship between national liberation, ending partition, and the socio-economic inequalities experienced by workers and families across Ireland. While shining a light on the systemic abuses of the Orange State in the north, Phoblacht also exposed the anti-worker, anti-Republican politics of the southern political establishment. In the absence of a generally democratic media environment in Ireland, Phoblacht has been a much-needed platform for challenging the failing capitalist system and championing workers' rights and trade unionism, the importance of public housing, a strong public health service, and the need to build a fair economy. It was a formidable platform too for political education, giving young activists the tools to not only counter the official propaganda of the state, but the political ideas and language to educate the grassroots. Every edition expands the minds of aspiring revolutionaries, every page filled with international examples of solidarity that gave them strength that they weren't alone. Indeed, Phoblacht has a rich history of reflecting the internationalism of Irish republicanism. Indeed, the paper played a proactive role in fostering the bonds of solidarity between the Republican movement in Ireland and struggles for freedom and economic justice throughout the world, most notably in Palestine, South Africa, and Cuba and Nicaragua, as we talked about. Finally, and it's very proud to be able to say, like the Republican struggle for national liberation itself, Phoblacht has gone through many changes and continues to develop. In 1985, it became the first newspaper in Ireland to have a female editor. In recent years, it became the first newspaper to provide an online edition. So thanks very much, Pablo. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to participate here tonight, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's a fascinating account history, which I was basically ignorant of, and I imagine even people on the left in England and elsewhere in the UK will probably again not know that much about. So it was, at least for me, it was a massively interesting and inspiring to hear all that. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Hugo, as I said earlier, founder, co-editor of Jacobin Brazil, based in Brazil, if I'm correct, or you can correct me there. And yeah, Hugo, I'd like your thoughts on the issue, the media. I mean, link it to Bolivia if you feel that's okay, but maybe talk more about your experience in Jacobin Brazil and how it relates to the project of the Jacobin project
Hi
adapted in Latin
everyone.
America.
Buenas tardes, good evening. Obrigado, Nathalia, boa tarde. I apologize my Brazilian working class English and thank you for the invitation and congratulations on the event. My name is Hugo Albuquerque. I'm a lawyer and I I fight in the defense of activists and the social movements, and I have a publishing house too, Autonomia Literária, uh, which is dedicated to publishing books by radical thinkers, Asianis Varoufakis, Tony Negri, and other Brazilian thinkers, social movements, and social struggles around the world. And when we decided to publish Jacob in Brazil, is it was part of this effort to link Brazil with other countries around the world. Well, exactly as Nathalia uh, told, Brazil is not linked properly with the other Latin American countries. That has a historical explanation, the language, but the question of the growth of Brazil. Brazil was the only Latin American country, except Mexico, who became independent with a European monarchy. During the 19th century, we were very not very longer very distant of the other Latin American nations, because other Latin American nations was republican countries fighting against ancien regime, and Brazil has a very conservative vision in its growth. Basically, here in the third world, the struggle within the media is central and particularly difficult. On the one hand, we have a deep concentration of media in the hands of ruling oligopoly, whose power lies in preventing people from knowing what's happening in their own country. Uh, and they also do the same in relation to communication with our countries and our sister countries and the relation to the rest of the world. In other words, we are isolated here, and that's why it's one of the most important points that explains how Bolsonaro is Brazilian president. Uh, I belong to those who believe the social exploitation is central feature of the system itself, and not only that the exploitation of the humans by humans is international. The so-called imperialism still can and must to be considered. The backwardness of our nations in the global south is linked to the advance of countries of the north. It didn't happen in the past, but it happens right now. It is evident that our countries have their own oligarchies, but they work together with the elites of the north. And without that, much of the oppression we experienced would be impossible. The dispute is over who we give the voice to, whether the oppressors, such as the global corporated media, or the oppressed. And here, from the third world onwards, it means a particular dispute of method in communicating to the world the maximum degree of capitalist oppression, which can often sound exaggerated and impossible, even for those who live in relatively poor areas of the rich countries. In Latin America, for example, is today the epicenter of COVID-19 global pandemic. And why? We didn't have the worst data a year ago, but today we are being victims of these governments which came to the power by this coup d'etat or elected because of great support from international capital, and also to the lack of vaccines for poor countries. This is not the coronavirus. This is politics. This is imperialism. That's why now Peru is the biggest disaster of coronavirus pandemic, but Brazil is living under a real genocide, and Bolivia too, and Colombia too. If we study the data of coronavirus, we realized that in this year the things got worse in South America. That's imperialism. In short or run or struggle is to point out of how our daily misery is not natural or something inevitable. Our battle is to confront the dominant ideology and to illusionism and its main weapon, which is precisely to produce confusion, ignorance, and evasion, or our inability to communicate. Today, everyone now, Bolivia is under siege. The country was the victim of a coup d'etat. But there's an imperialist and a coupist movement now against Bolivia. And I am now in São Paulo city, the biggest city of the southern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. In São Paulo, the biggest foreign community in São Paulo is Bolivian. Bolivian people in São Paulo is like Mexicans in the United States. Many times we ignore our Bolivian or hermanos Bolivianos or Bolivian brothers. And the big question is, Brazilian government worked by this coup d'etat. Tuto Quiroga, one of the principal coupists, make a conspiration in Brazilian embassy in Bolivia. Without Brazil and Bolsonaro's regime, the coup d'etat in Bolivia was impossible because now Bolsonaro is one of the principal agents of the global imperialism in Latin America. Basically, the battle of the Bolivian people against this terrible coupist movement there is part of our resistance against the genocide in Brazil, because we are being killed by the government objectively. There is an enormous scandal of corruption now about the buy of Indian vaccines in Brazil, and Bolsonaro's government is killing us. Yeah, even Bolivia, that's a country with less money than us, has, for example, good politics to fight the coronavirus than Brazil. Why is this happen? Bolivia, there is exists a socialist government. In Brazil, we have a genocide, fascist government. So, I believe that our effort in independent media here is an enormous battle against our oligarchy, but we know that our oligarchy is a part of global oligarchy too. And we know that we must talk with our sister countries or brother countries, and we must to make the effort to communicate it to the world. And more important, the things need to be called by their name: genocide, fascism, and we have to break through this terrible barrier. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hugo. Again, a number of questions spring to mind, but I want to encourage as many people as possible that are taking part in the Zoom, people that are listening on Zoom, but also I think across other platforms. I know I've been told that they will feed in any questions that come in. I want to encourage as many to take as many questions as possible and not just abuse my position as chair to ask away. So I see that Jeremy Fox, who I know, so hola Jeremy, someone with a deep knowledge of Latin America, has put a very interesting comment and question, which I'm going to read the comment and the question out. It says, on the issue of Brazil being historically somewhat estranged from the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America is of course true, and Lula in particular, as well as figures like Pepe Mujica, have recognized this and tried to strengthen the ties between all the countries in general, between all the countries of the continent. However, Latin American countries in general seem to know each other very imperfectly despite the formal regional groupings. The attention of their mainstream media and politicians being directed far more, I suspect, to the US and Europe. What I'm suggesting here is that there is still much to do to secure a real sense of unity in Latin America. What do the panelists feel about this question? And I will, it might be sort of directed perhaps at Olly, Nathalia, Hugo a bit more than Chris, but Chris, feel free to come in as well. And I'll just add, given Telesur, the pan-Latin American channel that was that began in 2005, that I have that I've worked for, Olly has worked for in the past, others might have had a relationship, a state sponsored channel that was created by the Chavez government, with a specific aim to provide that counter-hegemonic media outlet that could essentially rival something like CNN and tell Latin American stories from the region. So maybe taking Telesur as an outlet, maybe into the question, what do panelists feel about Jeremy Fox's observations and question? So I don't know, Nathalia, do you want to begin?
Well, the Union of Latin America is in the core of the Workers' Party movement, is the core of the landless movement, the Movimento Sem Terra. It's the core of many of social movements from a left perspective in Brazil. They all know that it's impossible to achieve significant changes in the country without the union with our neighboring countries, and also to use the successful experiences of neighboring countries as examples, if you want to use that word. In media, we all remember that Lula, nowadays, I don't know if his opinion changed, but Lula did not want to participate on Telesur when the project was proposed. Lula preferred to invest in the national TV with the Brazilian public. And nowadays that Brazilian public TV is completely pro-Bolsonaro, of course. And so I don't know if he's regret, if it's something that he wants to reevaluate when he's in power again, crossing my fingers, 2023. But what Lula nowadays say, and I had the opportunity to interview him for it, is that he wants that people now have to follow, support, and consume a lot of the content of the independent media, because the independent media in Brazil was the one that supported him and supports all the progressive movements happening in South America constantly. We have in Brazil several outlets, Brasil 247, Revista Fórum, and so many others. Of course, real content, we have like Jacob in Brazil, but we cannot expect to have a huge reach of reaching too many people, because still we don't own the means of making too much publicity, or the means of reach out the people who doesn't have access to internet or whatever. So of course, many a Telesur at this point would be very useful in Brazil.
Interesting, because I mean, one of the critiques that came to Lula from the left after the coup was that, and perhaps it's a critique that can be made of the Corbyn, of Corbyn here in the UK when he was that the media reform policies were not radical enough, and that these essentially, you know, came back to bite him very, very, very harshly. His, you know, the where the money was spent, Globo, all of these actors who were not, you know, good faith or were never going to be friends, and perhaps a lack of maybe engaging with Telesur, engaging with independent media. Olly, I want to ask you, I mean, we have the question, which is obviously something to reflect on, but you said that during the coup, you know, Kawasachi News essentially became the only outlet. Do you think Evo Morales, when in power's policy towards media reform, to democratization of the media, would you say there were limitations, critiques that can be made? Do you feel that the new government has perhaps, and if so, has the new government learned from that and decided that it needs to be more forthright, more strident in media reform, in democratizing, in basically breaking the power of oligarchic media, who, as we all know, historically in Latin America, they are political actors. They are political actors that play decisive roles in coups in Chile, El Mercurio, Agustin Edwards in Venezuela, the media barons calling people out on the street to do. They are key right-wing political actors in Brazil today, in Mexico, Televisa, you know. So has the Arce government got, would you say, a kind of a policy towards the media that points towards sort of democratizing and breaking some of this power?
Hey, yeah, I think this has been a key weakness in Bolivia. Precisely, I mean, as I mentioned in the first part of my intervention, that all of the private media in Bolivia, anti-Evo Morales, anti-Mas in a very serious way, and that the only counterbalance has been essentially state media, and now Radio Kawasachi Coca is now you know, a leading media outlet that is not of the state, but which can still present the views of social movements. And I think that has been very important. And in terms of democratizing the media, I'd say, you know, the government promoting and sponsoring community outlets and alternative media outlets has been really positive, and has been able to provide some of the resources for these sort of alternative outlets to grow and to be able to match the mainstream media outlets. I think so. That is, I think, on what they're getting right at the moment. But there hasn't been a serious discussion about, you know, trying to break up the big sort of oligarchic media outlets. And I think that's been quite disappointing, because throughout this period, there's been a number of instances of the mainstream media publishing outright fake news on a quite deliberate basis. The most recent example is just a few days ago, when essentially this was the #1 story in Bolivia for days. Someone dug up an old video of Evo Morales talking, you know, about a month ago, where he's saying, in regards to the general strike that was in August 2020, he said it was right that our demand be elections and not for Áñez to resign, because if Áñez had resigned at that moment, then the military may have taken over. It made more sense politically to push to make sure that we could guarantee elections, and through elections, obviously, we came back to power. And the media presented this on all the headlines of all the main newspapers as Evo recognizes the legitimacy of Áñez because he recognizes the constitutional succession and says that he supported her being in power and calling for elections. And he specifically told his supporters not to call for a resignation. And they were saying that he was talking about November 2019, which he wasn't. He was talking about August 2020, a very, you know, particular moment. So they twisted something very completely, and this was the #1 story across all the mainstream media outlets in the country. And another example, which I always love to use when talking about this sort of thing, I remember a few years ago, a headline in the leading right-wing newspaper called Página 7 says, "And Evo Morales, the price of basic goods has gone up 100%. and that's true in terms of but the basic prices of things. What they don't also state was that people's incomes across the board, and particularly for those on the lowest incomes, the minimum wage in that same period has gone up 300%. So, that's a quite key piece of context that you're missing there. You're portraying, the country has been mired in some sort of out of control inflation and people not being able to afford basic goods, when the reverse is true. In fact, things in real terms have got cheaper for people because people can have higher incomes. And so even if prices do go up 100%, if your income has gone up 300%, you can still afford not only what you used to buy before, but you can afford more things. So that is just, just one of the examples of the way in which the media really manipulate the public narrative in a way that's often outright false. And I think people are really angry about this. And whenever, the mainstream media outlets go to marches or events with mass supporters, they always get heckled. They get told that you're the corrupt press, you're the sold out press, you've sold out to, foreign interests. And there's just such a level of hatred, I would say, of resentment and bitterness on the part of ordinary people who feel just completely discriminated against by the mainstream media. It's not just Evo Morales they attack people. They attack the majority of the country who support the mass. And there was one particularly nasty incident last year where the mainstream media went to a town in this region, Entre Rios, basically say, oh, look at all these people, because they're ignorant, they don't understand about the pandemic, and there's people not wearing masks and things. So people started shouting at them, and they said, oh, we were attacked today. But people, people had enough of being completely discriminated against from the largest media outlets in the country. And I think people would really, there's a huge appetite and hunger for some sort of media law to be able to regulate some of what's going on, because it's something that's completely out of control. But of course, if that is to take place, you'll get all the usual narratives, most likely in Western media and from the United States, that they're suppressing media freedom, et cetera, et cetera. We know the score that's been said about Venezuela 100 times, about every other country 100 times. So that would be what Bolivia would have to run up against.
Thanks a lot, Olly. We've got two questions on Telesur from Patrick Black, but I think we'll come to them at the end of this first round. I wanted to bring in Chris. Now, thinking about the question that Jeremy Fox said, which is obviously kind of quite specific around Latin America, I want to kind of bring it to Sinn Féin, and you were talking about the Latin American bulletin that is included in one of your outlets, in a magazine or I couldn't remember, it was an email. So my questions are, why does Sinn Féin feel, I mean, you've talked a little bit about of a long-standing solidarity links with Latin American revolutionary struggles, but why does Sinn Féin do this with other regions, or is there something about developments in Latin American politics that makes Sinn Féin want to explore this in greater depth? And what would you say Sinn Féin has learned, or what lessons is it drawing from the processes of change and counter-revolution and that have taken place in Latin America? And just one little addition is, and what kind of media policies has Sinn Féin set out for kind of, how does it see the oligarchic media, the independent media? Does it have concrete policies in this regard?
Yeah, well, I suppose the reason is probably multifaceted, but one of the things that's undoubtedly true is that there's definitely a nostalgia in Ireland about Latin America. And again, I think Nathalia and John's piece nearly paints to that. Some of our own revolutionary figures, such as Roger Casson, for example, played a great role in the Amazon around human rights, etc. So there's always been a nostalgia for Latin America. So there's always a great interest in people wanting to get more information about it. Information is very scant. The only time you ever see Latin American politics on the mainstream media is if something has gone wrong if the global corporate media believe there's an interest to sell, then you get it. And you don't hear about the grassroots movements. You don't hear, you know, I don't think I've ever seen a report on the mainstream European media about, you know, the plurinational status of Bolivia, for example, or anything like that. So I think that sort of real appetite for that information. We provide that bulletin to EU diplomats. We've provided to EU embassies. For example, this week we'll be doing a briefing with the Foreign Press Association with our party leader, Mary Lou McDonald. We'll obviously be touching on a number of events, but that will be accompanied by 2 bulletins. One will be a Latin American bulletin, and the other one will be a Middle Eastern Palestine bulletin. And again, this gets past much of what we believe is that sort of neoliberal bias, that mainstream bias, that you don't get to see this piece of information. We set out very strongly in recent months, actually, our position on Israel. Our position, Israel obviously is a pariah state. Again, the mainstream media and the usual suspects come at you with allegations of anti-Semitism and other things, but it never sticks in Ireland. Again, I think it's that close memory of the anti-colonial struggle and what it's like to be oppressed. And thankfully, it just simply doesn't stick. Similarly with China, there's an attempt now to paint up any sort of discussion about China or any sort of discussion about the opportunity to build a multipolar world. You know, again, is, you know, they go straight to Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation. They go straight to Hong Kong or Taiwan, and there's no space at all for, you know, a reasonable sort of discussion about this. This is something that we continue to try and work our way through, and we believe is important. It's increasingly important. And to be fair, actually, to the Irish government, it's something that they've maintained a fairly strong line on as well. Whenever it comes to international matters, like we've seen that recently with Palestine as well. You know, not afraid to stand up. Now, increasingly, that's been also seen a process in recent years, very unfortunate. And this has happened after 10 years of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil in power, the Conservative right, where they have jettisoned Ireland's long-standing neutrality on the international stage to move closer to NATO, to move closer to the more militarized European Union vision for the future. That's not a popular position in Ireland, and it's something that we continue to attack. You know, we believe that's very regressive and should be avoided at all costs. But I suppose at the heart of all of that, Pablo, is really a determination that, yes, and again, I think it goes through, and that's why I touched perhaps on that sort of 50 years experience with Unfoblak, the need for us to have alternative media platforms to get our message out, etc., through, you know, struggle. Is this determination that, you know, we adhere to our politics. And one of the big lessons, I think, from Latin America, certainly, and I touched on the last event about Bolivia, obviously, as well, was the importance of political education. And I think that's where the example of Latin America and using Latin America, no matter what struggle it might be, going back to El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cuba, whatever it might be at all. And for many of our young activists, you know, they're really, really excited to read about it. But inevitably, it's really good for them as well. You know, to see that linkages now between Indigenous people, especially now in the context of climate action and the need for combating environmental breakdown, that they're able to say, no, we need system change. And they point to Indigenous movements in the Amazon or whatever it might be, and the likes of Bolivia and now Peru as well coming forward. And they're starting to connect the dots. And they could never do that through mainstream political education in schools, which is completely lacking. It takes that political education through the likes of Unfoblak and other radical sources as well.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Ugo, in terms of Jeremy's question, I mean, I read it a while back now. If you remember it, it's there in the chat.
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
First point, Telesur was a very important medium. So I believe I agree with Nathalia and Brazil. Camera. Yes, I think that Brazil, Lula mistook about Telesur, and now I think that he learned something about this, because not only about Telesur, but when we speak about independent media, and more than Lula, Workers' Party, because the media which supported the progressists and even Lula when he was in the jail, or when Mrs. Dilma Rousseff suffered a coup d'etat, was the Brazilian independent media, the media from the steel workers, as TVT, for example, the steel workers trade union TV support Lula all the time. But I think that is necessary effort with other countries in Latin America and in the world. And I think that the project of Telesur is very special because it's an international project of popular communication. And it's very important, but to grow a Brazilian Telesur or a space of Brazil, we think that the autonomy and the specificities of Brazil in Latin America, the language, but a cultural construction, a cultural building that let us very distant of the other Latin American countries. It didn't begin yesterday. That's I'm speaking about centuries and centuries of history, and even the Portugal and Spain rivalry in Europe. Our process of colonization was specific, and our national building was a terrible, had terrible difference with our Latin American brother countries. As I said, Brazil wasn't a republic in its beginnings. Brazil had slavery for more time than any other Western country. So we need this effort. We need to do this dispute even into Brazilian left. But I'm optimistic because I believe that Lula and Workers' Party blurred the election, but the dispute must to be done. And I think that we have good opportunities. Principal now, when Bolsonaro is being defeated by the streets, by the movement of trade unions, and I think that our left wing is losing some illusions about how democratic the Brazilian right wing and the Brazilian bourgeoisie. Because I listened by many pitches, Workers' Party dirigents, that in some moment of the history, they had illusions about this, illusions about how solid Brazilian democracy can be, and even the posture and even the role of the Brazilian bourgeoisie. During a long time, I think that part of Brazilian left-wing dirigents proved that the Brazilian bourgeoisie accepted democracy, but they don't accept it. And this process, when 500,000 of Brazilians died, and I can trust, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians lost by a criminal omission of this government. This is the Brazilian right wing. This is the Brazilian army. That's an enormous problem too, because after the monarchy, who kept this majesty was the Brazilian army. That's basically a political party. This is a part of the dispute, but the point of view of the left wing and the social movements, we have all conditions to do this dispute, but we need to integrate Brazil in a communicational structure. But our challenge is connected the international structures of communication as Telesur with our independent media here. This is not easy.
Thanks, Hugo. I'm going to move now. We don't seem to have a mountain of questions, so I'm going to carry on here. I'm going to linking Telesur. There's a little point just of information that maybe I'm going to go back to Nathalia. Maybe you could just clarify the status of Telesur under Dilma, under Lula then Dilma, was Telesur something that the average Brazilian could watch? Was there, I know there is a kind of a news digest that is produced by Telesur in Portuguese, a kind of summary of some of its news. But could someone in Brazil watch Telesur under Lula, under Dilma, and under Bolsonaro? And that's just a point of information. And then I kind of want you to, given that you and Olly are the journalists here who are covering Brazil predominantly, but also other countries, and Olly Bolivia, but also other countries, in English, and a part of a kind of left-wing independent media, one of the few outlets that there exist. I mean, there's not that many. I'd want Nathalia first, and then I'll bring Olly in to reflect on what the other independent media outlets that are not specialists, shall we say, on Latin America, but for example, in the UK, there's a number, Nova Media, there's Jacobin in the US, that is not regional specific. What do you feel that, do you think that they have learned lessons in how they covered Bolivia under Evo Morales, and how they covered Lula and Dilma, the processes which, you know, were coups? What do you think that this independent media, which, you know, that Brazil Wire forms part of, that Kawasachi News forms part of, what do you think they might have learned in the past couple of years? So I don't know, that was a very convoluted set of thoughts, but Nathalia, maybe you could start with the point of information around Telesur and then offer some thoughts.
Well, Pablo, I think in Brazil right now, you can only watch Telesur by internet and like cable TV, maybe perhaps. When I remember that many years ago when I lived in Brazil, we could watch it on cable, but it's not a open sign TV because Telesur, Brazil never had a participation in the creation of Telesur because it was an idea of Hugo Chavez, and it has the participation of Argentina, Venezuela, of course, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Cuba. But when they offered Lula to be part of the founding countries, because Telesur is made as a multi-state company, Lula said he would rather to invest in something in Brazil, and some critics say that Lula tried to not be part of Telesur, to try to soft their relations with the media monopolies in Brazil. We see how this turned out for him, because the same monopolies of media in Brazil sold out the idea that he was corrupt. They sold out the idea that he was a criminal, that PT was a horrible party. And even with Bolsonaro killing half million Brazilians, we have the media saying that PT and Bolsonaro are the same. So that's Lula. The Brazilian people still paying for Lula not wanting to go on board with Telesur. Let's put it like that. And about like working with the Anglo media, I think that when it comes to Brazil, they have learned the lesson, of course, because like Bolsonaro is someone that it's hard to compare because he's really over, like he's beyond imagination. He's basically a cartoon villain, the things he's doing. He's destroying not just the international credit Brazil used to have, but also the Brazilian people, the economy, the society, the environment. So of course now the media, the Anglo media is more careful when they are talking about Brazil. It was very interesting to see, including the coverage of The Guardian about Brazil, because they used to be like kind of like ironic, that's very British humor talking about Bolsonaro. and always bashing on Lula, and nowadays they are even like interviewing Lula and giving like a more decent, I wouldn't go too far to say they are decent, but a more humane approach to what the left is doing in Brazil. But of course, they still have a very critical opinion on PT. The other outlets, they put Bolsonaro as a villainous mastermind, but they never put out the fact that Lula is gaining cases, that he's proving that he was a victim of a political imprisonment, that he was that he's trying, that he has a huge support behind him, that he's trying to start a campaign to bring back Brazil to what it was when he was in power, not just like in economical sense, but also in social advantage senses as well. So I don't think that the media, I'm sure that the media, the Anglo media, not just the British media, they are like more or less okay now, but the North American, the US media is still very critical of Lula, so they try to put Bolsonaro as a villain, but they do not put an alternative. They simply say the horrible things Bolsonaro is doing, but they are not saying that the left in Brazil is going to the streets, we are organizing protests, we are doing an opposition to Bolsonaro. But I think that when the time comes in the elections, we will see many opinion pieces, including here in the UK, especially with how the Tories have worked with Bolsonaro, being overly critical of Lula and like trying to put him and Bolsonaro as the two sides of the same coin. So I'm not too hopeful to see many honesty and legit support for the rise of the left once again in Brazil.
Thanks, Nathalia. I wanted to move to Olly, and maybe I mean, I know I kind of asked a question to both of you, but the name of The Guardian has come up a few times in this discussion so far. And funnily enough, I was living in Venezuela in 2005 when The Guardian sent their first Latin America correspondent for 20-something years, Rory Carroll, who's Irish and is now The Guardian's Ireland correspondent. You know, I would argue that The Guardian has been at the forefront of a kind of smear campaign against most of the Latin American left governments, at least since Rory Carroll joined. But I would be interested to hear, and just for the viewers that are joining us from Bolivia or elsewhere, The Guardian, you know, is supposedly the most progressive national newspaper in the UK. It has a very popular website that has a kind of a very big reach and is viewed as progressive by many, if not liberal. I would recommend a book in English, unfortunately only for now, looking at 200 years of The Guardian, and a chapter specifically by Alan MacLeod on The Guardian and Latin America. Alan is an excellent media analyst, and it's a devastating chapter that would, I would say, reinforce the thesis that The Guardian has been a systematic enemy of progressive change in Latin America and arguably elsewhere. So I wonder, Olly, you know, the outlets like The Guardian, the New York Times, the supposed liberal wing of the of the US, should we be surprised that I mean, first of all, how would you evaluate? I don't want to assume that I suspect you might agree with me, but I don't want to assume that. Should we evaluate their reporting? Is it purely, I mean, is it ignorance? Is it fair? Have they reported it fairly? Is it ignorance? Is it malicious, bad faith reporting? And secondly, do you see some of these trends in some of the kind of independent media outlets, perhaps that have existed? How was the Jacobins? How would you evaluate Jacobins reporting on Evo Morales and other independent outlets like that don't focus on Latin America per se?
Sorry. Yeah, I think the question in the New York Times in particular is quite important because they actually did give space for a study to be published in the newspaper that basically debunked the idea that there was electoral fraud in Bolivia under Evo Morales. You know, a research by some researchers associated with MIT managed to produce a statistical analysis of the OAS report and show that it was completely flawed. And I think that was an incredibly important thing. But then what happens when Bolivia, when Luis Arce takes power and Henning Áñez is arrested, the New York Times releases an editorial, a formal position of the paper, you could say, basically condemning this, describing it as political persecution. They actually, they say there were serious allegations of electoral fraud, something that their own paper, was a key part of debunking just a year ago. They, one particularly crude part of their editorial was talking about how, yes, Áñez did sign a law that meant that the members of the armed forces bore no responsibility for the killings and a decree of immunity, it was called at the time, and that was very bad and that was very wrong. But then she lifted it at due to pressure from human rights groups, which of course not what happened at all. It was lifted after the massacres had taken place, after her power had been consolidated, and she no longer had a need for these sorts of laws. So it was lifted in a big show of democracy. And so what I don't understand, well, I do understand, but we can see how they completely manipulated a situation to reinforce the tradition, the view of the State Department, not only under Trump, but also under Biden. This view was echoed by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, which is Biden's Secretary of State. And, it just, the reason this happened, I think I mentioned it a bit in my intervention about how, a lot of the time these media outlets, they depend on English-speaking journalists, the mainstream media within the country. So one who's normally used, for example, by America's Quarterly all the time, is the only Bolivian journalist who's has a voice there. There's a guy called Raúl Peñaranda who's studied at Harvard, and he founded one of Bolivia's most right-wing newspapers, Página 7, and he speaks English, and then he's the only contact they have essentially, and they use him for everything. And so if you're asking him about what's going on in Bolivia, he's going to give you a very one-sided view of the situation, in line with his own political interests, in line with the class interests that he represents. But then, rather than being honest about that, that's presented as just objective fact. So that's the distortion, I think, which takes place, not just from the New York Times, obviously, but on a much larger scale. Because at the end of the day, media is just about communicating things, but it's politicized in all sorts of ways. And what you choose to communicate, what you choose to report on, what you don't report on, what is considered a priority, what is not considered a priority, and the genius, you could say, or the achievement of the mainstream media is that they're able to do this, but by and at the same time obscuring those interests and obscuring those biases they have. Whereas outlets like ours are much more honest. We report the truth. We report facts, but we are an outlet that is owned by the 6 federations of the Tropical, which is a social movement that's set up Coca, and exists to transmit those voices. And I'm very honest about that. The mainstream media exists to transmit the voices of a different social class, but they're less honest about that. So I think we have to always keep that in mind. And yeah, I think the only solution is to build up these alternatives.
Because the Guardian would say that there are, whenever they're asked, when you read an article, they'll ask for money, and they say they're essentially they almost present themselves as an independent media outlet, despite all this trust fund, and it seems to me that there is a kind of case of wanting their cake and eat it. On the one hand, they'll obfuscate the role of the US in bringing down Lula and Dilma, and then have editorials, decrying Bolsonaro fascism. On the one hand, they'll kind of repeat the smears against the Morales government, and then they might do an article talking about the repression under Agnes. And I mean, there's another question actually here from Patrick Black, who wants you to expand a little bit quickly on what you said about the Arce government not having developed a more alternative, or not just Arce, Morales as well, not having developed more alternative left media or media reform. Why you think that might be the case? And then after that, we have just under 20 minutes, so we'll bring Chris and Olly.
Yeah, well, I don't think that there hasn't been anything done. I mentioned that I think the government of Luis Arce has done a lot to support alternative media, community media, sponsoring, local community stations, media outlets owned by social movements, and being able to, help with to attain some of the resources needed to do proper reporting, to do things in the way they need to be done. And that's incredibly important. I think building up those alternatives is the most important thing. Where I think there has been a bit of a failing is on trying to break up or at least regulate some of the mafia of the mainstream media. And I think that the main reason it hasn't happened is because of just fear that the media holds an enormous amount of power. If you touch them, they could go as far as provoking another coup. And I think the coup in 2019 was almost entirely a coup carried out by the media, because why would people protest against Evo Morales? None of the objective reasons that people around the world protest were there. People weren't hungry. There wasn't, some big inflation or unemployment. The country was objectively not a dictatorship, despite, the shrill cries of certain people. On an objective basis, it certainly was not. It had all of the freedoms the one would want. So why would people protest? It's because the media was able to generate such an environment, to manipulate the national conversation in such a way that they were able to then mobilize a significant enough number of people to just bring the country into chaos. So yeah, I think reforming the media is a bit like reforming the police or the military. It's something that anyone would want to do. The question is how you can go about doing it in a way that's effective and that doesn't provoke such a reaction that will blow back at you. So I think it'd be interesting to study, other experiences where this has been done. I know in Ecuador there was a very interesting communications law that was passed by Rafael Correa, but even there, the media in Ecuador is just as aggressively right-wing as it is in Bolivia. I lived in Ecuador, and it was just a wall of disinformation, really, to reading the mainstream media or watching the mainstream media. Had all of the same problems and traits as what exists in Bolivia. So despite them having the law as well, how much was that able to achieve? I'm not sure. I think it'd be maybe perhaps a topic for a separate event, how this sort of thing can be done.
Thanks a lot, Olly. I know Chris has shared one of the bulletins, so that's in the chat, so that's really useful for anyone that will. I'll certainly be reading that. And Chris, from what you've heard, obviously this is talking about Latin America, but in terms of Sinn Féin's positions of solidarity that it's taken with Cuba, with a number of countries. I mean, politically, is there a price? Has it had to pay a political price for this in Ireland, or is this something that is as you say, you seem to say it's non-negotiable? It's something that Sinn Féin does out of principle, and does it seek to sort of educate people in Ireland towards the positions that you're taking, rather than perhaps take positions which are seen in the short term as vote winning or popular?
Yeah, I think fairly strongly it's non-negotiable. I think probably stand out from other European centre-left political movements in regards to, even if you take our position, even where of the 5 central pillars of what is Irish republicanism, anti-racism is very strong, and anti-racism, anti-colonialism is embedded within our political narrative and who we are. I feel that other European centre-left parties over the last while, as they've failed, some of this has been around that they've tried to act tough, for example, on immigration, and they've fallen into cheap, popular racism at times. We've been very strong. Again, and Palestine is probably the most obvious one, and I know it's not Latin America, but again, in recent years, the British media in particular come very strong on the anti-Semitism stuff. You think even to the extent to which, and it would be maybe a bit criticism of the British Labour Parliamentary Party, maybe buckled under that pressure, but it never does with ourselves. And they do try. For example, the political establishment in Dublin would very often throw in our faces stuff around Venezuela. People would throw around stuff around Cuba, but it doesn't connect with the wider Irish public. It only connects with a very small ruling elite. Which again, I think is testament to the strong anti-colonial narrative in Ireland. The fact that, you only have to go back, a generation, 2 generations, to the likes of the War of Independence in Ireland. And that is very, very strong. And I think that comes through time and time again. I just want to add one anecdote to the stuff around The Guardian. Jeremy's actually away now, but I was actually in Venezuela with Jeremy during the last presidential election, and The Guardian actually published a story that day. We were on a bus traveling to one of the polling stations, that there were no international election observers and they were all banned. And to my left was Jeremy, someone from Britain. I was there from Ireland. There was people from the United States, from Spain, from across the world, and again it was Mr. Carroll doing the writing. So I made sure he was made aware of it whenever I returned, that I was indeed an international observer and we were there.
Yeah, no, it's staggering, and I think it's only brought home the level of dishonesty by the foreign media about countries such as Venezuela. If you know a little bit about the country, and if you're there, it all becomes completely surreal. I was in Venezuela filming once a documentary, and the BBC correspondent was saying it was impossible to go from 2 marches, and I went in 10 minutes from one march to the other. But there's a bigger question. It becomes a bigger of the levels of deception that are taking place here, and the question is why. And obviously I think that's probably another forum.
Well, sorry for cutting across you, Pablo, but we're taught at a very young age that electoralism should never be a priority over your political tenets, and I think that's what we always stick to. And political support electorally will come and go, but your grassroots and that political education is paramount, and internationalism for us is central to that. So that's why we're never unnerved if a media outlet comes at us for a particular thing. Then bonds are worth more in time.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Ugo, tell us more about Jacobin Brazil. You've told us why it was set up, but tell us editorially how it relates to Jacobin. How is that relationship? Jacobin is an excellent left-wing outlet, but arguably there is a critique that during the Lula years, during the Dilma years, it was perhaps it showed a bias towards critiques of the PT government that perhaps was slightly, there wasn't a kind of rounded approach to the PT. You could argue that there was a slight animosity to the PT that whilst, you know, the left should always debate these, I believe personally that the left should always be debating these things. I think there is a tendency, perhaps on the Anglo left media outlets to kind of to idealize processes, and when governments in Latin America have to make very hard choices in the face of US imperialism, in the face of sanctions that are killing their populations, in the face of armed insurrections that are being funded by Washington, and make hard choices, there are perhaps sectors of the Anglo-Western left that almost immediately swallow the narratives of the Guardian on these issues. So what is Jacobin Brazil trying to do for a Brazilian, I suspect, audience, or for a Portuguese-speaking audience? And yeah.
Well, technically, we are a franchise. First time, we have a publishing house, and we are always in dialogue with our American partners, because if the communication of Brazil with other Latin American countries is not properly, not so good, with America is worse. I understanding that the old positions of our American partners about Brazil and the Lula and the Workers' Party experience happens in other moments. I think that the coup d'etat had enormous impact in many groups in Brazil, and it changes the perception of the Brazilian process and the Brazilian experience, even in America. It let the things more clear, even in Brazil. I think that there was a enormous learning by many groups, even in Brazil, because I think that Lula is most realistic, and the Workers' Party dirigents about our bourgeoisie and the limitations of our democracy. And I think two other groups of radical left released that the problems in Brazil is more deep and serious than everybody imagines, because I think that many Brazilian and international radical groups think that many things wasn't done by Lula because he simply didn't want. But that's not a question of exactly desire, but an objective historical process. And I firmly believe that now even the Brazilian left majority and hegemonical left is more realistic about this process, and I think that Brazilian but American radical left has more consciousness of our limitations. So I think that today Jacobin US, Jacobin and even Jacobin Brazil supports Lula, but this support is a left-wing support. And personally, me and my group in Brazil, we always support Lula by the left. We never was a kind of hegemonical supporters or bureaucratic ones, but we particular always refuted some easy explanations of Brazilian radical left. But the history has a function. History teach lessons. This is the utility of the history. The history's utility, and I believe that everybody learned in this process. But that's always a tough dialogue, because America is a rich country, or American friends don't know how is tough the life in Brazil, because maybe the old Irish people knows how tough can be the life, but Ireland is a rich country now. England is a rich country now. even the richest parts and zones in United Kingdom are richest than Brazil. And Brazil has more than poor, a question of poor and exploitation. We have a very unequal reality. São Paulo is a normal city that has at the same time districts so developed as Norway and zones as poor as Africa and civil war countries. That's very tough. And our dialogue with our American partners has these cultural difficulties, but that's natural. It's part of our job, make this kind of dialogue.
Thanks a lot, Olga. I think we're going to bring things to an end. It's been nearly 2 hours. I think we've covered quite a few themes. We've looked at the issue from a number of perspectives, and we've had a really insightful talk from Chris around Sinn Féin and Ireland and how they are both sort of reporting on Latin America to their constituencies, to their members. And so I know we're going to have at the end Janeth Ramos to come in again from We Palace Across the World to once again tell us about the festival, which has still got a few more events to go. So I would urge people to look at the website, and there's a documentary on the Bolivian coup, which I haven't seen, but I'm very eager to see as a documentary filmmaker myself. So yeah, we're going to bring Janeth, but I just want to say thanks a lot again to Nathalia, to Chris, to Olly, and to Olga for their insights, and to the people that gave us questions and joined us. So thank you very much for joining us, and over to Janeth, who actually has a little comment, I think, as well, who said we should imagine a federation of alternative media in order to pass to another scale. So I'm fully supportive of that initiative. So sign me up for that. So over to Janeth, and thank you. Is Janeth here?
Sorry I didn't have the microphone on. Thank you, Pablo. And yes, it was very interesting to hear the different experience and your different contribution of the different alternative media. We see and we know that your role was a key in breaking the silence on what was happening in Bolivia and all the but to tell the truth, while the mainstream media, they were just demonizing all the left parties in Latin America. So we are aware of this importance, and thank you for all the reflection and analysis you did. We hope I think what happened in Bolivia and what's happening right now, for example, in Colombia or in Peru, it shows that the alternative media are our only hope to make hear the voices of people that are fighting in our country. So thank you for doing your job. Thank you very much. And yes, I will just remind our 14 days of resistance, our campaign right now. So far, we are going to, this Zoom meeting, it's part of these 14 days dedicated to alternative media, to the journalism that was with us. And we still have some days of part of this campaign. We will have in the coming days. There is, I think tomorrow, Claudia, is the date for we are going to have some guests, people that are fighting, defending the rights, indigenous people that are fighting for the rights in different countries in South America. We will have also on the 3rd July the documentary It Was a Coup in Bolivia. So you are all invited to take part next Saturday. And just for those maybe that still don't know, these 14 days of exhibition also, we have a wall mural in the east of London. So if you are interested, it is still possible to see till the 4th July. So you are all invited. So in fact, this wall mural is a replication of what we paint in La Paz, representing the death, the victims of the coup. So you can see it in the east of in London till the 4th July. So you are, and thank you very much, Pablo, for organizing this. Thank you for your work, Nathalia, Olly. We know and Chris, we know that we as civilians, people in Europe, we have to support the local medias that are surviving. We know that it's difficult to do your job when you have all the mainstream against them. So we know that we have to support local media and community media. What we have in Bolivia, maybe it's an example also to follow for in other countries. So now that in Peru we are having a left party in the government, so we expect to have also some replication of what we starting doing in Bolivia. So thank you very much. And yes, we are going to conclude our meeting. I think saying by our Hayaya. So I don't know, Claudia, maybe you will come.
Thank you. I've just opened everyone's microphone. We're going to have our usual Hayaya, which is living well and good life for everyone. Thanks everyone. Thanks Nathalia, Chris, Pablo, Olly, Hugo, Janet. It really has been a lot your work. It's really special thanks on Wipalas across the world and all the people that mobilize for Bolivia and the region in Latin America. Hayaya Bolivia, Hayaya Latin America.
Hayaya.
You have to repeat Hayaya. Hayaya. Wonderful. Thank you so much.